a final video for the foreseeable future for the Great Texts and Philosophy playlist. And this video is on The Bald Soprano by Eugene Ionesco. The Bald Soprano is a nice illustration of theater of the absurd. Theater of the absurd is a tradition in modern plays, or better yet, postmodern plays. It's largely a 1950s European thing. These plays focused on the idea that life is absurd. This tradition in plays is associated with the philosophical tradition of existentialism. It's not necessarily the same philosophy, though. The theater of the absurd tends to end a play where the play began, making the structure of the play into a sort of circle. One possible way of interpreting this genre is to connect this circle structure to Nietzsche's concept of the eternal recurrence of the same. Now, actually, in Nietzsche, the eternal recurrence is probably best understood as well, I won't say only a thought experiment. There's Nietzsche knowledge I don't possess. And for the record, there's a lot of theater of the absurd knowledge I don't possess. So far, we're doing extremely rudimentary introductions. Anyway, in Nietzsche, eternal recurrence is probably best understood as a thought experiment, challenging us to affirm life. Even if life never actually gets us anywhere, because life itself should be sufficient. If everything that happens now has happened before and will happen again, do we have the strength to welcome it? It's meant to be a very optimistic idea. If we apply this to the genre of theater of the absurd, perhaps the lesson will be that the characters are supposed to affirm the life they are living in their largely pointless stories. Or they're stories that have no point other than the story itself, other than the life of the characters within the story. That should be sufficient. And we're supposed to do the same with our lives in the real world. No objective fact about the meaning of life, affirm life. Anyway, that would be a Nietzschean perspective on this sort of thing. Now, it's a separate question whether the authors of the play agree with this sort of thing. Actually, it's a separate question whether it even matters whether they agree. And whether they agree is another question. I'm suggesting these Nietzschean ways of thinking are one plausible way of thinking about theater of the absurd. That's all I say. In this series, we've already seen probably the single most important play that's associated with this tradition, Waiting for Godot, or Waiting for Godot, by Samuel Beckett. That is to say, we saw it in this series. If you stumbled across this video by itself, you've wandered into the end of a playlist on great plays in philosophy. Find it on my channel if you want to see the rest. Okay, so Eugene Ionesco is a central figure in the tradition of theater of the absurd. He's a Romanian/French guy. He wrote a play called Rhinoceros, in which the protagonist helplessly watches as everyone around him turns into a rhino. Apparently this is a parable on mass blind conformity to ideological movements. He wrote a one-act play called The Lesson. To my shame, I have not actually seen The Rhinoceros. There's a film production with Gene Wilder and I want to say Zero Mostel. I hope I'm pronouncing that name correctly. There's a film production of The Rhinoceros I haven't seen. I couldn't even find it for purchase on Amazon last time I looked. He wrote a one-act called The Lesson, which I've seen performed, which is humorous but dark. In The Lesson, a student meets with a professor for a lesson. The conversation turns to nonsense, and then the professor murders her. The professor's maid reproaches him for having let himself kill another student, because this has apparently happened a lot of times before. And at the end of the play, another student shows up, presumably doomed to die in the same way. The genre of theater of the absurd has a lot. Ionesco has a lot that I'm not well qualified to comment on. In this video, and the remainder of this video, I hope to mainly just introduce one play by Ionesco, which is going to be, I think, a lot funner than Waiting for Godot. That is to say, well, at any rate, it's a lot less depressing. Waiting for Godot, or Godot, I find just terribly depressing. I don't find The Bald Soprano depressing at all. I find it somewhere between amusing and downright joyous. It's so ridiculously fun, and funly ridiculous, and funnily ridiculous. At least that's how it works for me. These connections to existentialism, I don't know. I may talk about them more later in the video. They are plausible connections. Don't assume too much of this. If you look up information on Wikipedia about Ionesco, you might find that Ionesco and Sartre certainly did not agree on everything. Sartre was too friendly to communism by Ionesco's reckoning, and Sartre thought there's a problem with life. It seems absurd. We don't have any objective facts about the meaning of life. Sartre says, if God existed and had given us a purpose, that would be great. The existentialist finds it extremely embarrassing that God does not exist because we need meaning in life, and this most obvious source of meaning doesn't work because there's no God. Well, that sucks. But there's still a solution. Sartre evidently thought that Ionesco didn't give us a solution to the problem with life. But Sartre's philosophy is meant to give us a solution. Existentialism is the way of avoiding nihilism. Existentialism is not the solution to nihilism. It's the solution to the problem that nihilism fails to solve, the problem that there's no pre-existing meaning to life. But existentialism tells us, okay, now you can make your own meaning for life. So we're not going to do much of that necessarily. I'll probably at least suggest that this is one plausible way of interpreting such a play. But let's talk about the play. And spoiler alert. Ionesco's The Bald Soprano begins in an English home, and it features two married English couples. There's an English maid, and there is the local fire chief. The play consists of some thoroughly meaningless conversations and social interaction. Perhaps the main point of the play is that social conventions are absurd. Or perhaps it doesn't mean anything. Maybe it's just weird and random and funny. Here's some things that happen in the play. Mr. and Mrs. Smith have a ridiculous conversation. It's great. It's awesome. They talk about Bobby Watson. They talk about, I don't know how many different people, but they're all called Bobby Watson. Bobby Watson, who died. Bobby Watson, his wife. Bobby Watson, his son. Bobby Watson, the son's uncle. I haven't counted the Bobby Watsons recently, if I ever have. It's a hilarious random conversation. Hang on, let me just semi-randomly find a bit of dialogue. He's a good doctor. That's Dr. Mackenzie King. He's a good doctor. One can trust him. He never prescribes any medicine for him. He never prescribes any medicine that he's not tried out on himself first. Before operating on Parker, he had his own liver operated on first, although he was not the least bit ill. But how does it happen that the doctor pulled through while Parker died? Because the operation was successful in the doctor's case, and it was not in Parker's. Here's a thing I don't understand. In the newspaper, they always give the age of deceased persons, but never the age of the newly born. That doesn't make sense. It's a wonderful conversation of thorough ridiculousness and self-contradiction. Mr. and Mrs. Martin arrive, and they spent a long time discovering that they have met before and are actually married. And then the maid shows up and talks to the audience. How's the phrase go? Breaks the fourth wall. She talks to the audience and advises us that Mr. and Mrs. Martin are mistaken. Each still does not know who the other is, or even who they are. Presumably, this is a commentary on how much we often do not really know other people, not even friends and family, like King Duncan's line in the beginning of Macbeth, about how there's no art to figure out from the face what a person's true character is. Perhaps this is even a commentary on how we often do not really even know ourselves, like perhaps Hamlet's curious reflections on his own life. Or perhaps, again, it doesn't mean anything. It's just weird and random and funny. More stuff that happens. Rules of probabilistic inference break down. The doorbell rings, but no one is there. 3 times in a row. 4th time it rings, the fire chief is there. The Smiths and the Martins have a debate on whether the proposition, when the doorbell rings, there's someone there who rang it, can be established by experience. It only seems to work if you ignore the first 3 rings. Perhaps the sentence, when the doorbell rings, there is no one there who rang it, can be established by experience, but that only seems to work if you ignore the 4th ring. Anyway, the fire chief arrives. He is looking to put out fires, and he wants to put out fires in the fireplace, if there are fires. Also, he's friends with the maid, apparently, or something, maybe lovers. It's not clear to me, but their words when they see each other after apparently having not seen each other for a long time, I don't know, they seem to suggest to me maybe there was some former romantic, amorous relationship. More conversation happens, stories are told. Of course, they don't make a lot of sense. There's a lot of stuff I don't have time to describe. I think maybe I should give one illustration of the absurd stories. The fire chief tells a story called The Head Cold. And it goes something like this. I don't know if I'll read the whole thing. And I may have to skip some of the dialogue that interrupts it. My brother-in-law had, on the paternal side, a first cousin whose maternal uncle had a father-in-law whose paternal grandfather had married as his second wife a young native whose brother he had met on one of his travels, a girl of whom he was enamored and by whom he had a son who married an intrepid lady pharmacist, who was none other than the niece of an unknown fourth-class petty officer of the Royal Navy, and whose adopted father had an aunt who spoke Spanish fluently, and who was perhaps one of the granddaughters of an engineer who died young, himself the grandson of the owner of a vineyard which produced mediocre wine, but who had a second cousin, a stay-at-home sergeant major, whose son had married a very pretty young woman, a divorcee, whose first husband was the son of a loyal patriot, who, in the hope of making his fortune, had managed to bring up one of his daughters so that she could marry a footman who had known Rothschild, and whose brother, after having changed his trade several times, married and had a daughter whose stunted great-grandfather wore spectacles, which had been given to him by a cousin of his, the brother-in-law of a man from Portugal, natural son of a miller, not too badly off, whose foster brother had married the daughter of a former country doctor, who was himself a foster brother of the son of a forester, himself the natural son of another country doctor, married 3 times in a row, whose third wife, whose third wife was the daughter of the best midwife in the region, and who early left a widow, had married a glazier who was full of life, and who had by the daughter of a station master a child who had burned his bridges, and had married an oyster woman, whose father had a brother mayor of a small town who had taken as his wife a blonde schoolteacher, whose cousin a fly fisherman, had married another blonde schoolteacher named Marie, too, whose brother was married to another Marie, also a blonde schoolteacher, and whose father had been reared in Canada by an old woman who was the niece of a priest whose grandmother occasionally in the winter, like everyone else, caught a cold. That's the story. And Mrs. Smith's response, skipping over some dialogue that intervened in the middle, Mrs. Smith's response is, a curious story, almost unbelievable. Mrs. Martin, excuse me, Mr. Fire Chief, but I did not follow your story very well. At the end, when we got to the grandmother, the priest, I got mixed up. Like, she didn't get mixed up until then. Like, how many different random connections from my brother-in-law to someone's grandmother who occasionally got a cold in the winter. And you only got lost at the end, Mrs. Martin. And you find that almost unbelievable, Mrs. Smith? It's thoroughly ridiculous, and it's magnificently ridiculous. It's hilarious. It's fun. Stories happen. They don't make a lot of sense, etc., etc. And eventually the fire chief is about to leave. And on his way out, he asks about the Bald Soprano. The reaction is general silence and embarrassment. Why are they embarrassed about the question about the Bald Soprano? I don't know. Mrs. Smith observes that the Bald Soprano always has the same hairstyle. You need that sound effect for terrible jokes. Or GIF. Or someone playing that sound effect on the drums. So, the Bald Soprano. What about the Bald Soprano? Well, she always has the same hairstyle. Fire chief leaves. The Smiths and the Martins then shout meaningless things at each other angrily. The play ends with them screaming, "It's not that way, it's over here." They scream that at each other, and the lights go off. And then the beginning of the play repeats itself, right here at the end. But now the Martins have taken the place of the Smiths. So, what's it all mean? Well, if it really is about social interaction, it might mean that social interactions are meaningless, or that we don't really know each other. Maybe we don't even know ourselves. One philosophical perspective on this to be taken very seriously is Confucius' perspective on social interactions. If they're done properly with Li, that's Li. Now that's the pinyin system for translating, the pinyin system for transliterating Chinese words into Romanized lettering, Li. And that's transliterating Mandarin into English using the pinyin system. Using a different system in a different language, say Cantonese Chinese instead of Mandarin Chinese, I think you would say Lai. And using Yutping, I think you'd translate it, but Yutping is a system that is often used for transliterating Cantonese Chinese into Romanized English-style lettering. It would be LAEE 3, I think. 3 indicating the tone, an even middle tone. Never mind that. Confucian, Li, Lai, or ritual, or rite, R-I-T-E, or etiquette, or politeness, or rites of propriety, as James Legge translates it. Confucian, Li, ritual, rites of propriety, etiquette, politeness, helps us get our social interactions right. Good Li, good Lai, ritual, rite, propriety, politeness, etiquette, rites of propriety. These things cultivate and express virtue, and virtue is the purpose of life. Social interaction is very meaningful. Even our social rituals are very meaningful and profound. Get them right. Reflect on them. That's a very serious Confucian perspective, which I suppose would be opposed to the perspective of the play. If the play is meant to tell us that social interactions are meaningless. Having said that, I doubt rather, that that's the point of the play. I think the meaninglessness of the social interactions, the stuff about us not knowing our neighbors, not even knowing ourselves, or even our own spouses, I think it's mostly just random and funny. I think if the play can be tied down to a perspective, it's probably going to be something like existentialism. And I think I'm going to have to close where I think I started, with something like Sartre or Nietzsche. There is no objective meaning in life, and possibly no objective meaning to the play. The point of life is to affirm life. That's not an objective meaning of life. There's no pre-existing or fixed meaning of life, says Sartre, but you get to choose your own meaning for life, and you should. And Sartre gives you some guidance on how to do that well. A few ways you shouldn't do it, some things you should do as you choose the meaning of your life. The point of life is to affirm life, Nietzsche. There's no pre-existing meaning for life, Sartre, but you can choose your own meaning for life. And as for the play, there's no objective meaning to the play, but you can certainly enjoy it. When you and the audience are watching the play done well, when you, the reader, are reading the play, you can enjoy it. The characters in the play, well, they ought to affirm life. They ought to affirm their own ridiculous lives. They ought to enjoy themselves. And I dare say, if Sartre entered into this play as a character, he would say, you ought to choose what you're doing with yourself and with your life and do it responsibly. Take this decision seriously. And it's possible he would find some characters in the play to commend or criticize for how they chose to go about their lives. I don't think I'm going to get any deeper than that. I think probably some version of existentialism is the right way to interpret this play, if this play is representing any perspective at all. But maybe it's not. Maybe what it's saying about our lives is that our lives are absurd. And if that's what the play is saying, then we can step out of the play and we can do whatever is necessary, which is to say, we can speak the truth about our lives, which might well be that our lives are not meaningless at all. I don't think so. I'm a Baptist. I think our lives are meaningful. I'll sign the Nicene Creed as a statement on the meaning of life. Anyway, I guess that's the end for the foreseeable future of the Great Plays and Philosophy playlist. And maybe I'll see you on some other video on some other topic. Thanks for watching, and The Bald Soprano by Eugene Ionesco is ridiculous and wonderful. Strongly recommended reading or watching, if and when you have the chance.